So imagine yourself entering a building that rises on a rough-cut black granite blocks in Brunkenbergstorg in Stockholm. Or standing in front of a 13th century mansion in Rue de Cabanis, a complex overstretching the 14th arrondissement in Paris. Or perhaps taking a boat tour to the Isle de los Alcatraces lying in front of San Francisco Bay Area, which is known as the Rock. How would an everyday person generally describe all these sites? What would he deem them to be when thinking about their actual representations? Or rather, what would they signify to him? If he were to use just one word, what reference would he grant them? He would most probably claim to be seeing them either an economic, as in the central bank in Sweden, a medical, the famous Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris, or a correctional facility, as famously the Rock is known. But he would say an institution. Or perhaps even something more emphatic, he would say the institution that shows up for any other institution, the general imaginary that he would have. So we can take a number of other examples, also from the business world. The greenish, park-like Googleplex, which is now the symbol of the new era at Mountain View, or a sturdy brown brick Volkswagen facade in Wolfsburg. Now indeed, when called upon to make factual generalizations of any great societal achievements, a cautious observer would most surely succumb to such eloquent reasoning. Unquestionably, these kinds of exercises tend to promote a romanticized referencing of institutions, highlighting almost entirely their positive content, which accumulated through the course of cultural growth. Now, what is far more seldom observed is a critical debunking of their contents. And to verify this conjecture, one just needs to go further and ask whether one would consider marriage or family or religion or the Catholic Church also as an institution, or language, for instance. So if we abstract from specific names or sites in our above itinerary, what implicitly postulates is a determined social fabric that is composed of different entities and phenomena that come to be experienced by human subjects as their immediate social objectivity and what I choose to call an institutional framework. But of course, if we posit a determinate social fabric or an institutional framework, one inevitably has to presuppose a variant of materialism out of which this entire social fabric can originate. And in history, we know these types of attitudes from Hobbes, his mechanical materialism, Feuerbach, anthropological materialism, Marx's and Engels' historical materialism, or even Veblen's technological materialism, that would ground either of their thoughts. In France, in the last few decades, it has brought an entire new turn in contemporary philosophy, particularly in ontology, by the works of Alain Badiou. His very famous postulate, mathematics is ontology, and our claim here is that his application of Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory in mathematics could be fruitfully extended to re-articulate the, I quote here, I put this in quotes, ontological plane of Veblen's institutionalist social fabric, penetrating into it through his conception of habits of thought, which could be conceived as a formal, axiomatic precondition for institutions. So I have two theses that evolve around this text. First, that Thorsten Veblen is one of the very last materialist economic thinkers to have significantly questioned the object of knowledge in economic theorizing. And secondly, that a new turn is potentially unfolding in the field of contemporary philosophy. I speculatively call it a neo-mathematical turn. So to approach Veblen and Badiou simultaneously, we have to commence from the following question. What if the institutionalist thought of Thorsten Veblen already entails a determinate formal inscription of social categories and ontology of its own? What if his theory of instincts, elaborated in the instinct of workmanship, already delineates an ontological schema of the social realm? A lot has been said in the recent years, particularly in Veblen's theory of instinct, which only adds to the unresolvedness of his and amalgamation of his theory as a whole. But for me, what I try to show, or I try to articulate a new formalization of his institutional framework to propose a model that rests on his theory of instincts and draws simultaneously from the mathematical set theory on ontology proposed by Badiou. So, how have I done it? I tried to make a close reading of Thorsten Veblen's theorizing of institutions qua habits of thought, mediated through instincts. And I tried to show how actually each of the instincts that he develops correspond to the axioms of the Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which I don't cover here because it's too long. But this is the general idea what I try to show. Just fast forward a little bit here. And give you just a quick glimpse, sorry, but just to read through a little bit of definitions stemming from Veblen and also in philosophy, just to give you a glimpse of how I wanted to approach it. So here is Thorsten Veblen, I think this is in his theory of workmanship. As a matter of course, men order their lives by this, that is current business-like scheme of economic life, by these principles and practically entertain no question of their stability and finality. That is what is meant by calling them institutions. They are settled habits of thought common to the generality of men. Later he says, like all human culture, this material civilization is a scheme of institutions, an institutional fabric and institutional growth. But institutions are an outgrowth of habit. The growth of culture is a cumulative sequence of habituation. And of course, this is Veblen. And a couple of decades later, one of his associates, Clarence Ayres, quite famous institutional economist, poses it a little bit different. I quote him: all are forms of social organization and as such parts of a larger whole, which is organized society. Thus, it appears that what we mean by institutions is the parts and the subparts and sub-subparts into which analysis resolves the whole substance or content of organized society. Later he says, the term institution is not a structural category. That is, it does not refer merely to the division of the total substance of society into its constituent parts. It is rather a functional category. As such, it has reference to a certain type of social organization or a certain aspect of social behavior which is qualitatively different from another aspect or aspects, one in which different forces are at work to different effect from those to be observed in the other aspects or aspects of social organization. So this is Ayres talking around in the mid of 20th century, around 1950s. Veblen wrote that in 1918, his definition. And fast forwarding now to a contemporary definition of institutions, particularly in social ontology and economics, we have Jeffrey Hodgson, who is now the leading figure in institutional economics, and he says, what is it like this? Institutions are the kind of structures that matter most in the social realm. They make up the stuff of social life. And further, without doing much violence to the relevant literature, we may define institutions as systems of established and prevalent social rules that structure social interactions. And Tony Lawson from Cambridge poses it a little bit differently, but quite similarly. Institutions are particularly form of emergent social phenomena, mostly social systems or structured processes of interaction that are either intended to be, whether or not they are, or are discovered a posteriori to be and are recognized as relatively enduring. And these two definitions have their basis in John Searle's definition, which I put now. An institution is any collectively accepted system of rules, procedures, or practices that enable us to create institutional facts. These rules typically have the form of X counts as Y in C, where an object, person, or state of affairs X is assigned a special status, the Y status, such that the new system status enables the person or object to perform functions that it could not perform solely in virtue of its physical structure, but requires as necessary condition the assignment of the status. The creation of an institutional fact is thus the collective assignment of a status function. This is John Searle, and according to which then the contemporary heterodox institutional economics and social ontology actually then unfolded. So there are a lot of different definitions, and of course I had to add my own. And my own was, as I said before, a really tight reading of Thorsten Veblen, perhaps too speculative and too tight because of nearing it to Badiou, but it's the way I see it. So let me just give my working definition of what I've then, after all reading all through this, how I pose it myself. It says like this: habits of thought are in themselves institutions. They are indifferent multiplicities presented as a collection or a set of elements and organized according to a determinate relation of belonging. Different collection of multiplicities, that is, habits of thought, can also count as one. They are made consistent that are either represented under some determinate law of count. So you can see this is where I actually draw from Cantor, which is used also in Badiou, quite almost to the point. So the main reason for this will be made clear. We will maintain throughout the article that the ontological structure of an institutional framework adheres to the logic of multiplicities. This can be either inconsistent or persistent, presented only in the pure form of elements or sets, or in the latter case, consistent as a collection of determinate elements being counted as one. Now, the act of distributing and aggregating of elements therefore comes as an effect of elements counting as one, a new set born under some determinate law, or as it is the second part. So we say that to consist means to exist. Consequently, to be subsumed under a determinate law is to, as to paraphrase Cantor, is to be thought as a one or a totality, and this brings us closer to what Plato's forms or ideas define. So if I look one last time to the various definitions above, and even before what I've talked about previously, we can either have institutions themselves as an object of science, of sociology. We can have them as an accepted system of rules or means in the philosophical discourse of John Searle, or we can have them as settled habits of thought, as it is with Veblen. So my focus is entirely on the third definition, that of settled habits of thought, and I pursue them in a Veblen's institutionalist traditional economic thought. Veblen, to whom we by all means attribute a thorough philosophical comprehension of economics, for instance, deals with the category or idea of the category idea in relation to the habits of thought, the particular substance that makes the institutions. Now, this fact can be most clearly extricated in his theory of the business enterprise, where he tracks them down in the context of pecuniary norms invading the domain of the older institutions, to which, and I quote him, the notion of pecuniary liquidation seems to have been wholly remote from the range of ideas, he puts in brackets, habits of thought, on which these relations and duties were originally based, end of quote. And a few pages later, he expresses them even more correlatively. And I quote him, with this change in the dominant interests of everyday life came a corresponding change in the discipline given by habits of everyday life, which shows itself in the growth of a new range of ideas as to meaning of human life and the new ground of finality for human institutions. New axioms of right and truth supplant the old as new habits of thought supersede the old. End quote. Now, Veblen here enigmatically indicates that he might be endorsing a conception of the idea premised as a system of axioms. and that is grounded on the prevalent habits of thought. Furthermore, he interprets man's habits of thought as, I quote him, their ideals and aspirations, their sense of the true, the beautiful, and the good, end of quote, where he most obviously indicates his Kantian affection for understanding of these categories and what habits of thought to encompass. The general influence of pragmatic philosophy on Veblen is today almost entirely undisputed, but a much lesser amount of emphasis and credit is given to science of Kant's shadow in his theorizing. Particularly when one takes into account, as observed before by Heidegger, that Kant is also a philosopher of the axiom par excellence. Therefore, we follow this thesis that is also a crucial step for Veblen. The presupposition of an axiomatic ordering of philosophical categories in his mode of presentation enables his mission to develop what he says a genetic inquiry into institutions that will address itself to the growth of the habits and conventions. Cantor, for instance, similarly to Veblen, also relied on Darwin in search of a genetic, or in his own words, organic explanation of nature, resting precisely on a theory of manifolds or sets that will supersede a mechanical interpretation of nature. The transworldly character of habits of thought can be observed in the following passages, emphasizing that they are, I quote Veblen again, a matter of tradition out of the past, a legacy of habits of thought accumulated through the experience of past generations, in which the instinctive ends of life are worked out under any given cultural situation, is somewhat closely conditioned by these elements of habit, which so fall into shape as an accepted scheme of life. End of quote. So if we succumb to the conception of the habits of thought to be understood as a category of idea, what then becomes of this determinate law that remakes an indifferent manifold of elements into a consistent multiplicity to count as one? Its function is to demarcate the invariable protocols of, say, formal operations or processes that elicit the shaping of a determinate institutional fabric composed of many counts as ones, those which historically form specific habits of thought. Veblen put it perfectly straightforward. Instincts designate the modes and possible structures for the formation of habits of thought. So in the preceding section, I will try to show how the formalizing instincts as habits of thought into a minimal axiom system will be capable of deriving an institutional framework in similar fashion how Alain Badiou proposes to use Zermelo set and Franklin's set theory for philosophy. So why choose mathematical axioms at all? Veblen provides a possible answer in one of his footnotes, where he distinguishes pure mathematics from applied mathematics and statistics and economics. I quote Veblen. Mathematics is peculiarly independent of cultural circumstances, since it deals analytically with mankind's native gifts of logic, not with the ephemeral traits acquired by habituation. End of quote. End of quote. So axioms entail a mode of axiomatic thinking of undefined terms, of yet to become multiplicities of an ontological thinking of progress. Now, sticking to this basic imposition of set theory as proposed by Cantor, and committing to a more literal reading of these axioms of set theory, we could somehow formalize these axioms as instincts, which I will not go into because it's a whole range of reconstruction I did. And perhaps I would just stop at this point. I think I've made enough of this introduction to what I wanted to show, and probably a lot more critique opening up. So I would like to thank you for listening to this part and concluding this point.